Service design, I'm going to start talking about the fundamentals of it, and then I'll start to go into the tools of the trade, and then Cam's going to take over and get us to the finish line on tools. So, what is service design? We have a very basic definition here. It helps you understand the unique needs and challenges of end users, as well as your employees, and it takes those needs, desires, challenges, everything, and it aligns them to improve the overall experience. So it's looking at a service holistically, understanding how a service is functioning for like what's being delivered for the end users, what are they experiencing as they go through it, what are the your employees doing, like where are their inefficiencies, what support processes and systems are being used, and it looks at everything. So we're going to talk about some of the tools for that we use in service design, starting with personas and archetypes. Those help to personify end users of a service, understand their behavior and the use of the service. We use these to understand who the audience is and what their needs are. And we'll also talk about journey maps, which some of you may be familiar with. They help you understand who, what, where, and how the steps of an experience are realized. So, what is happening? What are the steps? What are the stages? And what are our end users doing, thinking, and feeling during it. So that can also include that emotional journey, capturing sentiment as they're going through the steps. We use these to understand pain points and opportunities throughout the process. And something else we didn't highlight here is journey maps are typically very individualized, and then you can use that, synthesize what you've learned, and create a more general experience map. And then there's also the service blueprint. So we'll walk through that. The service blueprint gives a more comprehensive look at all of the journeys together and their actions for the different players who are involved. We use this to understand the relationships, how those and the tools impact service delivery, and look at it as an end-to-end audit. So from start to finish, and start could be just awareness that something even exists. What are all of those steps? Let's talk about some of the benefits of service design. I think it's something that potentially is, well, I know it's like still very new to local government, especially. I think it's something that's employed more at the federal level. So to some degree, we're still helping local governments understand what it is and how it can benefit the services that we provide for our residents, our business owners, everyone who comes into Baltimore and loves it, and making sure that their needs are met. So, benefits: it helps customers easily use and enjoy what you offer. In this case, we're talking about it in the context of government services. Um, it supports employees who are delivering that service to make their work easier. We want to make things more efficient. While we are centering the end users, the goal is really to find that sweet spot where you're giving end users what they want to make their lives easier, but also making sure the process isn't cumbersome or super inefficient for your employees as well. Because that also affects their demeanor and how they interact with the service as well. It helps you understand inequalities and inequities in service delivery and center the needs of priority populations. And we always like to shout out Creative Reaction Labs toolkit that they have, where they have some really concrete tools for taking a look at existing inequities and seeing where they exist. And that's their equity-centered community design toolkit. So just wanted to put a shout out for that. It helps you also know exactly where your pain points are before implementing a new system, so you understand what the current challenges are and status quo. It's also really helpful to know what's going well too, because that's a great thing to provide to some of your leaders as you're trying to improve a service and say, this is what we know is working well. It's also helpful for the employees too to know what's going right and not just what's going wrong. So it's not super demoralizing as you're just focusing on like what could be better. And then also helps you iterate and prototype lower cost solutions before investing time and money in something that's higher fidelity or more permanent. Okay, so we wanted to provide some real examples from the work that we've done for Baltimore City as part of this. And so the example we're going to share is recent work that's been done. We started working on it last fall on special event permitting. So, question we asked: how might we reimagine the process for special events permitting, which supports employees and event organizers to achieve their event goals? So, we had been asked to form a work group, take a look at what the current challenges were, and really modernize and improve the current special event permitting process. And there was quite a bit to modernize because everything was still paper based. The employees didn't have like great tools that they were using, and we were able to bring in some technologists with the expertise that we needed to solve some of these problems, and some human-centered designers. And we formed this super work group that was comprised of members of transportation, rec and parks, police and fire, IT, and then the Baltimore City Innovation team and our new digital services team. So really a super team that started tackling the major pain points throughout the permitting process. So wanted to streamline the system, recommend some solutions and bottlenecks, and then um, uh, test out some different things and do some pilots. So audience here are residents, are permit techs, people who are hosting events in Baltimore City. So that's the example that we're going to use as we walk through this. So talking about one of the tools, personas and archetypes, we wanted to explain that and then show an example from special event permitting. So for personas, these are motivations and demographics of people who use and deliver your service. It's really more focused on some of these commonalities, like you're putting a face to it, you're giving them a name. It's much more personalized than an archetype would be. So you give them a name, some demographic information, what they do for a living, what they're trying to do, and it helps you again understand their needs and how you're using the service. These are often used in marketing. So best for looking at motivations broken down by some of those key demographics, and can also be used more proactively. So we have our Jane Doe here example from special event permitting, and now we'll talk about archetypes, which are um, uh, there's a distinction. They're like similar but different. So archetypes center behaviors and patterns without expressing a defined personality or demographics. So they're a bit more generalized. They focus on incentivizing or changing behavior and can help tailor your service again to meet needs, but on a more general level. So the example here, we have a detailed event organizer. There's someone who over communicates. They want to get the event off the ground with little to no back and forth. So don't want to have like excessive dialogue communication as they go through. So they want to be able to like take their application from last year, zhuzh it up a little bit, put it in the context of this year, and that's that. So I just want to share a quick example of the understanding the difference between personas and archetypes. So some of you may be familiar with Joseph Campbell's book, A Hero with a Thousand Faces. This is an example from Nielsen Norman Group, so shout out to them for putting this in context. He wrote the book A Hero with a Thousand Faces, where he talks about story templates. And one of those story templates is the unlikely hero from humble beginnings. That would be an archetype. So that's like a common story template that you see. So that's the archetype. And an example, a personification of that archetype would be Bilbo Baggins, right, from The Hobbit. So the archetype is that unlikely hero, and the persona is Bilbo. It's that like specific person. Okay. So how to build a persona or archetype? You conduct interviews or a survey with your audience. Your audience should have a range of familiarity with that service. So you really want people who understand it. Could also be very helpful, and we'll get into this with means and extremes, to interview people who haven't interacted with it to understand why. Find some behavior trends and similar priorities among your audience. Why are they using your service? What's stopping them from excelling? What's holding them back? What are their major challenges right now? And then narrow down or classify using those means and extremes, which I'll walk you through. I love when doing any kind of user research, anything with service design, focusing on those means and extremes, because it helps you to really understand why people are using your service or not. So means are the average people who would use a service, right? They're in the middle. They might have some difficulty or not throughout their experience. They represent sort of average knowledge of the service and processes. And then your extremes, on the other hand, those are your on the one extreme, like your super users, people who are like, they are repeat customers, they keep coming back, they interact with things all the time. And then the on the other extreme would be sort of like your novices, more inexperienced, either they haven't really interacted or just never interacted or not very much. And when you are doing user research and you're focusing on those extremes, the middle sort of solves itself, because if you're understanding what their like needs and challenges are, you're more than likely going to capture the needs and challenges of the middle. So we really like to focus on extremes as a more of a strategic move.
So I'll take us through two tools that once we have our personas and archetypes, a journey map and a service design blueprint can really help us to solidify and really start to see our service or our tool in action. The first tool we're going to talk about is our journey map. So our journey map visualizes an employee or a customer's experience with your service. And it does this through two dimensions, both the overall process, what steps they're taking, right? And you can start to see kind of not only the who, right, but the what, when, where, why, how, right? How are they actually grappling with this? How we'll walk through these is I'm going to show sort of the layout of what a journey map looks like, and then we'll see an application with our special events work. So this may look like a complicated diagram, but we're going to break it down. So when you're starting a journey map, right, the biggest thing that you want to track is what steps, right, are people doing to get through this service or get through this process, right? So that's your 1 through 8 you see here on the top. I always like to label who it is I'm working with and maybe what their position is, or again, that demographic information we talked about, if it's applicable. Something you can also track with that sort of what is how they're feeling, right? Where are they having a really great experience, right? Maybe you put a star by that, or you kind of build your own system, or where are they frustrated? You can then, I always like to break these down in smaller pieces at the bottom, so that way I can really call them out. The where, sort of at what locations are they doing this? Is it in person? Is it digital? When, how long does it take them? But also, how long should it take them, right? So maybe this is a piece of information you bring in after the fact. Why, sort of what's their end goal? This can pair really well with that emotional state that I, just referred to. Also, what's their motivation, right? What are they hoping to get to, and where do they actually get? And then how pairs with that where really well, sort of what tools are they using? So whether that's digital or analog. So if the where is they're using everything online, the how is what specific sites are they using? That's the kind of way to think about those two pieces. The next layer of this map is to think about these stages. So once you kind of have your core components of those steps, right? You want to start to group them for the stages, right? The stages are thematically kind of what's going on in these steps, whereas the steps are the actions, right, that they're doing. So again, two very similar words, but we'll break it down. So example for an event organizer, right? This steps might be they're reading through the DOT site for that application, they're downloading materials, they're talking to their peers, maybe people who have gone through the process before. But the stage overall is learning, right? They're learning this process, they're learning how to go through it, because this is all stuff that happens before they even start filling out an application. And what stages can really help to uplift is this idea that the process is when it's realized, sometimes it's different than maybe what we expect. So stages can sometimes really help uplift those. Sometimes they can match actual steps of your process, but I really like to do stages sort of secondarily to really make sure that I'm seeing what the actual process of folks is. So on the next slide, you'll see kind of an application of this, right? So for our special events permitting that we keep referring to, when we're really looking into our permit text, right? We saw not only their actions, you can kind of see that on their first layer, the materials and location. Again, I said that those can pair really evenly with each other. And then the timing, right? This timing across the bottom was sort of the ideal timing we see. But you can see as we look at the stages, some of them are grouped, right? It's not even one-to-one, right? And especially as we look at that planning piece, that was unique to our permit text, right? They were planning with folks. And so this was a really big part of their process that maybe we wouldn't think of if we think of just the process from a bird's eye view. When you have your journey map like this, it's really important to, again, consider adding that emotional journey, but also don't forget to validate this. Like if you have that, map, and again, I see this chat kind of coming through, take those assumptions maybe you made, or maybe there was a part that you were like, as I'm transcribing this, I want to get it down, but you do really want to validate with community. And we'll talk a little bit about how to do that as we get to these next couple slides. So taking a step back before we get to that synthesized version. So let's say you have this template, right? You're like, how the heck do I fill it out? There are a couple different ways that we've filled out journey maps in the past, right? One that we used in the special events permitting process was that working group session. We brought everybody together, we introduced the concept, and we said, okay, you're going to tell us what the process is, and you're going to tell us what you use in that process, right? We were only really focused on 2 layers of that information at the time. And this, I would say, I would recommend take a little bit of time with your audience. I recommend an hour to an hour and a half for this session, mostly because you want to introduce this concept, especially if you're turning it over to folks. And then you also want to make time for them to share out at the end, because everybody has a different sort of puzzle piece to this process. So there might be something new that someone shares, or a unique process that other folks can kind of learn from. You can shadow the process, right? You can follow an applicant through the process. This is something that the innovation team has done in our current work, where we followed an applicant through the hiring process, right? And you get to kind of see the steps through their eyes, right? In this, you can kind of use, if you're familiar with usability testing, some of that, okay, why? Like, what did you expect here, right? To get out that emotional journey. I recommend a full day for this, not because I think it's going to take a full day, but merely because you might follow multiple applicants through the day. It might be helpful to follow both the front end and the back end, right? So that person who is engaging with it and that person who is working with those folks. Sorry. and and then the last method I'll talk about here is secret shopping. So I would only recommend this if you're a newbie, right? If you're a person who has some experience with your process or service, this one might be, it's not impossible, but I would be a little bit cautious with how you use this. In this method, you're becoming a candidate of your process, right? You're going to observe how you navigate it. And this is where that new perspective can come in. Because if you're familiar with the process, you're going to have some insider knowledge. So it's, again, like I said, not impossible, but you might want to take note of where you're using that insider knowledge, or where you kind of say, oh, like maybe this wasn't as obvious. So to a beginner or to a person who's new to this process, that might be a little bit easier because they're not going to have that knowledge coming into it. I recommend taking a couple of days with this, but that's mostly logistics once you have it set up. All right. So we've talked through the hierarchy, the layout of it. We've talked through an example, and we talked through how to get to it. So you have all of these journey maps, right? I would recommend a journey map for every person, right? And then you're going to bring those together and you're going to create what's called an experience map, right? So this is sort of a documentation that synthesizes, that brings together all of those pieces. And as you look to streamline, right, Some questions that I always find really helpful when kind of I have all of these pieces and how do I start to merge them together, braid them together. I ask, what are the common touch points, right? What's working well, right? That I want to make sure to shout out. Again, as Emily pointed out in the process, it's important to find gems and milestones, but also where are their bottlenecks? Where are their attention points? How do I note these? And also, I always find it important to acknowledge that there might be some outliers, right? If we think about that super user and they get through that process in a couple hours, what's taking most people days, how are we reconciling that? Maybe what are the hacks or what are the steps or how are they navigating the system differently? And being sure to note those as I kind of look to create this holistic experience map. So a service blueprint is a little different from a journey map. It's not, they're not entirely not related, but they're kind of cousins is the best way to think about them. It's a comprehensive visualization of the entire experience. So what a service blueprint is showing, maybe instead of, thank you all for laughing, as doing wonders for my ego. So what a service blueprint is showing that maybe a journey map isn't, is it's showing those relationships, right? So a journey map is going to show you kind of a linear process, right? They may go back a step or two, but it's all pretty linear. A service blueprint is showing how those interactions are engaged together, right? So similar format, we're going to walk through the layout of it, and then I'm going to break it down a little bit more. So this one, I would actually recommend starting with the stages of your process. And maybe that comes from blending those experience maps. Maybe you want to try to root it back to that core process. But I would focus on the stages first, just because that always helps me kind of start to fill this out. You don't have to be rigid, but I always find it as a helpful starting place. You can consider breaking apart or merging stages. So when we did that special events permitting work, we blended the housing application process and the DOT process. Both deal with special events permitting, but both have unique beginnings, right? They both kind of feed into this overall process, right? So noting that in a special way. But we also decided to break out this step of paperwork and payment. That was a huge piece because it had so many decisions, it had so many players in it, and it was actually a much longer internal process. So we wanted to make sure we gave it its due diligence. So the front end here refers to the observable actions. There's this common sort of analogy that's cited when you talk about service blueprints of a restaurant, right? So the front end, think about them as the patron, right? They're the person that walks off the street, sits down at a table, order something off the menu, right? So for us, when we were doing special events permitting, these were our event organizers, right? And the materials that they were using were a lot of the application materials, right? Things related to getting that application in. Again, I'll give a plug here. Remember that tools can be digital and analog, and noting the back and forth between those is always a really important finding, right? So if we're continuing that analogy, think of this as the waiter in the analogy, right? They're engaging with the patron, but also they get to see all the fun stuff that's going on in the kitchen. So they're both present in the front end and back end. For the sake of our work, this was the permit tech. And if we go to the next slide, I'll show you how we note this on a journey map, right? So what were those linear actions, right? That 1, 2 for our event organizer, for our permit tech, actually become more of a dance here, right? If you think about those dancing diagrams where you have your feet start here and then they go here, right? And that's what sort of distinguishes the service blueprint, right? Because you get to see those interactions. It's important to note with an arrow kind of where the directionality of that action is going. So step 1 is going to our permit tech here in step 2. And then whatever the permit tech is going in the step 2 is going back to the event organizer for that 3rd step, right? So it's a little bit more of a dance here as we look at the service blueprint. And if we continue that analogy of a restaurant, this is the kitchen staff, but it's actually pretty large. It's, again, in that analogy, it's everyone from the chefs to the dishwashers, right? It's your directors to the people who are managing your permit tax in our example, right? And it's really the materials. If the materials were important on the front end, they're going to be super important as we look at the back end, right? Because a lot of times they're dictating what we see on the front end, right? If we're running an analog system on the back end, it's likely we don't have a digital system on the front end, right? So as we look at that interplay across the whole one, and this is why those interactions, this is why the service blueprint is so important, because we get to see how sort of internal actions are reverberating to our front end and likewise. So you can see a little snapshot. I'm sorry I couldn't make a bigger one. It was a very long horizontal map for our special events permitting process. But you can start to see some of the arrows, how we broke it out. And actually how we built this blueprint was we started with those journey maps, right? In that step one that I mentioned, we brought folks together, we asked them what was their experience of the process, what was their sort of piece of this process. And then in that step two, we started to stitch them together into one comprehensive blueprint. But as I mentioned earlier, and as the chat called out, a really important piece of this was on after we had a good draft going, we met with our city reps individually as well as a work group to not only validate the steps, right? Are these the actual steps, right? Are they being reflected in an appropriate way? But also at the end of it to note, okay, so we know some tension points are here, but where do tensions occur for you? Where is breakdown occurring in this process? So again, really uplifting what the points were that we needed to zoom in on in our process. And so this is just like a zoomed in version of maybe one slice of that larger map, right? So if the stage here is reviewing the application, you can see the event organizer materials are listed on the top. They have their application in print. They're going to come into the DOT office and they're going to hand over that draft, or maybe they have it completely filled out of that application to the permit tech. The permit tech is then going to take that. But a key piece of that interaction is they're actually going to return at minimum a financial clearance form to the event organizer. And what's going on in the back end is that the Bureau of Records and Collection is checking our event organizers' financial standing and financial record to make sure that they can pay back how much this event is going to cost, right? And if that's clear, then the application can proceed, right? So this is a back end step that's really dictating the rest of that process, but you wouldn't necessarily see it if you were just looking at those initial interactions. And then again, as I mentioned, those back end materials are numerous to make this step happen, right? They have to complete a financial form. They have to have an application. And then the permit tech in our previous process was entering it manually into Invista, right? And then we had those email communications back and forth to help push forward the process. So what the heck came out of our process, right? As Emily mentioned, we've been chipping away at special events permitting since fall. The first is a huge shout out to our digital services team. I saw Nazrin join the call. If any of our other digital services team are on the call, huge credit to them for this process, right? So some of the tensions we were finding in the process was, as Emily mentioned earlier, residents had to fill out everything by paper, right? It was still a paper system. And when they came into DOT's offices, only then did they find out that, oh, actually you need this other form, right? You're doing a block party. And if you want to serve alcohol, that's this whole other process, right? Beyond this. And then permit techs had to take that paper application that people lovingly filled out by hand and input it all online. So there was some manual data entry going on there that took a lot of time. And then on the back end, our agencies had all different platforms, as Emily mentioned. Sort of the larger move here is towards a CRM, because what we were seeing is not only did they have all different platforms, but they also had different best standards of practice, right? Which created this sort of gridlock of how to handle applications when they came in. And then some agencies, after permit techs had lovingly input that data by hand, were then printing them out to review them in an analog way. So there were a lot of different processes going on here. So the way the digital services team sought to remedy this was putting that application online. They also created a new sitemap. So again, we brought up user experience earlier here. So some user experience work going on with that. They created some more tool supports for event organizers, which looked like interactive checklist, but also citing those supplementary forms ahead of time and their reasons. And then what was great about this is they were able to automate it uploading into a Microsoft list, which, because we're on a Microsoft environment here at the city, meant that everyone could see it. So regardless if you had your own system to kind of organize, you know that that information is going to be here, and everyone who needs that information then has access to it. So it's a great sort of holistic system as we think from the front end, how it travels all the way to our back end in the process. The next sort of output of our sessions was thinking about, again, how do we start to unify, right? That tension that I shared earlier of there are a lot of different processes, right? And there are a lot of different agencies involved in special events permitting. So it might seem counterintuitive. You're like, oh, wait, you did a brainstorming after you collected all this research? Well, it was because from our research, we found that there was a huge need to kind of unify in this way. And we needed to articulate what that looks like in this new era and with our new tools. So key attentions we were focused on here were residents having to engage with multiple agencies in the process, right? So once they get past that initial permit tech relationship, then you're engaging with agencies directly. And agencies, again, like I said, having to use those multiple systems, which can conflict and further complicate the process. So the way that we approached our brainstorming session was, session one was, okay, let's define what a one-stop shop is, right? We're using this term, let's say what it is in the context of special events permitting. We then brought in our event organizers, and we brainstormed with them as well as with our agency heads, and started articulating ideas. Okay, from this definition, what does that actually look like, right? Let's start articulating some things. And then after that session, our folks voted on them, and we took our top ideas into prototyping, right? So starting to see a feasibility. And if we go to the next slide, you can see that session one and session two. And it was really powerful, again, as you go from these sort of ideas that are here on the left to really making them tangible. So even if, I think design kind of gets this rap for using Legos and Play-Doh and things like that, but sometimes it can be really powerful for putting down an idea and starting to suss out how folks are engaging, right? In this example on the right, these were Lego pieces that stood for all of the agencies. So how are the different agencies engaging, right? Where do they collect, right? This is a co-location idea, right? So how are they collecting? Where do they go when they're not? And how is that information flowing? I'll kick it over to Emily to help us wrap up.
Thanks, Cam. So just want to, just acknowledge too, like the work that was done to create the permit application was awesome. It's also, I mean, we're still collecting information. They're still collecting information on it, and it's really a pilot. It's putting it out there. It's continuing to collect information from people who are using it. Understand, like, are there any sort of issues that they have to work out? Are people finding any issues with it as they're going through and using it? So this is really when you think about service design, it's really continuous improvement. Like you're never totally done improving something, right? So something that you should expect is the unexpected and fully embrace it and don't get discouraged by it. So, for example, like having this digital application is amazing, but it also, with that, it increases the volume of applications that the city is now getting. So, they may need to think about resource allocation. They may need to have like different screening tools. Like they may need to think about, okay, how do we address the volume now that we have this amazing application online. So just to say that, it's sometimes there's a little bit of a domino effect where, you knock one down and a few more go down after it, maybe all of them. But you just have to stay patient and work through it. And when you have great team members, such as the ones in Baltimore City, it's not as challenging to do that. So keep refining and lean into the process.